At the mouth where the Plym and the Tamar meet the English Channel, a natural harbour witnessed 5 centuries of moments that altered the course of empires. From this same anchorage, Francis Drake observed the sails of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the Mayflower departed for the New World in 1620, James Cook set out for the Pacific in 1768, Napoleon arrived in chains aboard HMS Bellerophon in 1815, and on the 5th of June 1944, thousands of Allied troops embarked for the Normandy beaches. The images you will see throughout this film have been generated with the assistance of artificial intelligence, interpreting historical and archaeological evidence to reconstruct a visual past that no camera could capture. These reconstructions remain interpretive. Small inconsistencies may appear, but they allow us to witness streetscapes and harbour scenes otherwise lost to time. This is the story of Plymouth, traced from its Bronze Age origins through medieval expansion, the age of Drake and the Armada, the departure of the Pilgrims, the voyages of Cook, the devastation of the Blitz, and the comprehensive rebuild that followed. At its centre stands Plymouth Sound, the deep water that shaped every chapter of this city's extraordinary history. Long before Plymouth bore a name, the collision of rivers and sea had already shaped a harbour that would draw traders across centuries. Where the Plym and the Tamar spill into the English Channel, geology carved one of the world's great natural anchorages, the third largest on Earth, exceeded only by Sydney and Halifax. The limestone headlands and sheltered waters of Plymouth Sound created a maritime threshold between the tin-rich uplands of Cornwall and the open Atlantic, a configuration that Bronze Age merchants recognised as early as 1500 years before the Christian era. Archaeological evidence from the Mountbatten Peninsula documents this early commerce. Excavations have yielded Bronze Age and Iron Age artefacts consistent with the trading post that exported Cornish tin to Phoenician and Greek merchants, objects that contemporary scholars attribute to sustained contact with continental Europe across several centuries. Classical geographers, including Ptolemy in the 2nd century, recorded a settlement called Tamari Ostia at the mouth of the Tamar, a name that suggests the harbour's importance was known beyond Britain's shores. The Roman occupation left only traces at Mountbatten, never establishing the permanent fortifications that marked other British ports. After the legions withdrew, Saxon settlers moved up the Plym Valley to found Plympton as a modest trading centre. The Domesday survey of 1086 recorded Plympton as a settlement of some significance under the Count of Morton. By the early 11th century, however, the river had begun to silt, its navigable channel retreating seaward year by year. Merchants followed the tide, establishing a new settlement downstream at the site now called the Barbican, close to the river's mouth. They named it Sutton, Southtown in Old English, a fishing hamlet that would grow beyond the reach of early Norman surveys. Contemporary accounts describe a landscape of wooded estuaries and limestone cliffs, where small boats worked the inshore fisheries and occasional traders called for provisions. The sound itself remained largely empty, save for the cry of gulls and the shifting patterns of tide and weather, a natural harbour waiting as yet for the traffic that would one day crowd its waters with the fleets of an empire. The silting of the Plym in the early 11th century forced Saxon merchants downstream from Plympton, and by the 12th century a new settlement had taken root near the river mouth. Contemporary documents record this cluster of dwellings as Sutton, meaning simply South Town, though the pipe roll of 1211 shows scribes already reaching for another name, Plymouth, where river met sea. When Henry III granted Sutton the right to hold weekly markets in 1254, the charter acknowledged what traders had long understood, that this confluence of waterways offered shelter and access the older port could no longer provide. Archaeological evidence around the Barbican indicates gradual expansion through the 13th century, stone quays replacing timber jetties as wool merchants established warehouses near Sutton Pool. The exposed position that made Plymouth valuable also rendered it vulnerable. French forces burned a manor house in 1340, and Breton raiders returned to torch much of the settlement in 1403. Contemporary accounts describe inhabitants fleeing inland, whilst timber-framed buildings collapsed into the harbour. The town that rebuilt after these raids did so with defence in mind, stone replacing wood where resources allowed, though no formal fortifications yet enclosed the growing port. On the 12th of November 1439, Parliament issued a charter that accomplished two transformations at once. Sutton became Plymouth by Act of Parliament, the first English borough to receive incorporation through legislative statute rather than royal grant alone. This parliamentary foundation would shape the town's constitutional character for centuries, establishing a precedent that bound civic identity to representative government from the outset. By 1500, Plymouth housed perhaps 3,000 inhabitants, a secondary port compared to Bristol or Southampton, yet positioned with singular advantage on the western approaches. The castle quadrate had risen near the Barbican by the late 15th century, its four round towers guarding Sutton Pool, where the growing fleet sheltered. Stone defences and parliamentary charter alike marked a harbour town whose ambitions would soon reach far beyond the Channel, transforming this fortified settlement into a gateway for ventures that would reshape the known world. The decade that followed, Sutton's royal recognition carried the town beyond the Channel shoreline and into waters no English mariner had crossed. On the 13th of December, 1577, 5 vessels slipped from Plymouth Sound under Francis Drake's command, outfitted for the second recorded circumnavigation of the globe. Contemporary accounts describe provisions loaded across a fortnight, casks of salted pork and ship's biscuit stacked in holds that would endure 3 years at sea. When Drake returned on the 26th of September 1580, only the Golden Hind remained of the original fleet, her timbers battered and her strongboxes filled with Spanish silver taken from colonial ports across the Pacific. Queen Elizabeth came to the docks at Deptford and knighted Drake aboard the vessel itself, an act that bound Plymouth to the expanding machinery of English maritime ambition. The harbour that had served wool traders and coastal fishermen now harboured captains who brought back fortunes measured in foreign coin. Drake himself served as mayor in 1581, overseeing the dredging of leats that supplied the town's growing water needs, a practical counterpoint to the tales of plunder that followed his name through alehouses and dockyards alike. The summer of 1588 brought those ambitions to their sharpest test. On the 19th of July, beacons flared along the Devon coast, each signalling the arrival of the Spanish Armada, 130 vessels sent by Philip II to reclaim England for the Catholic faith. Legend holds that Drake was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the first reports reached him, and that he insisted on finishing the game before embarking. Whether the story reflects fact or the embroidery of later chroniclers, the English fleet under Lord Howard of Effingham, with Drake serving as Vice Admiral, did depart Plymouth Sound to meet the Spanish Crescent formation in the Channel approaches. What followed was 9 days of running engagement, English gunners harrying the Armada northward with longer range cannon whilst the Spanish sought to close for boarding. Contemporary Spanish accounts describe persistent cannon fire and contrary winds, conditions that scattered formations and left supply ships vulnerable. By the time storms drove the Armada around Scotland's northern coast, more than 5,000 Spanish sailors had perished, fewer than 100 from direct combat, the rest from shipwreck, disease, and the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Drake himself died of dysentery 8 years later, off the coast of Panama, his body committed to the Caribbean in a lead coffin. But Plymouth had already secured its place in the architecture of English imperial memory, a harbour where ambition met the open Atlantic, and where the defence of the realm had been tested against Europe's mightiest fleet. If this visual journey resonates with you, consider becoming a Channel member. Your support enables the painstaking work of rebuilding these lost harbours and dockyards frame by frame. Now the 17th century awaited. By the autumn of 1620, Plymouth's wharves had seen a century of departures for profit and conquest, but on the 6th of September, a merchant vessel left the Sound carrying passengers whose voyage would become the founding story of another nation. The Mayflower, a wine transport of 180 tons, bore 102 souls, 37 religious separatists who had spent a decade in Leiden, the remainder London artisans and merchants seeking opportunity, plus a crew of 30. Contemporary accounts describe the cramped hold where families sheltered amongst provisions for 66 days of Atlantic crossing, the vessel arriving at Cape Cod on the 11th of November and anchoring off the Massachusetts shore on the 21st of December. Before landing, 41 male passengers signed what became known as the Mayflower Compact, establishing principles of self-governance that historians recognise as the first democratic document in what would become the United States. The colony they founded became the second permanent English settlement in the Americas after Jamestown, and within 3 centuries more than 35 million Americans would claim descent from those passengers. Whilst Plymouth, Massachusetts grew across the ocean, the English town faced its own trial. When civil war divided the kingdom in 1642, Plymouth declared for Parliament against the Crown, a stance that brought royalist forces to its gates. The siege that followed lasted nearly 4 years, the longest of the entire conflict. Records from the period document the progressive scarcity within the defences, grain stores depleted month by month, disease spreading through cramped quarters where townspeople sheltered behind hastily reinforced medieval walls. The final royalist assault came when Sir Richard Grenville led thousands toward the eastern approaches, but Plymouthian defenders met them at the fields beyond the town and drove them back. Archaeological evidence from what became known as Freedom Fields Park shows the extent of the engagement, musket balls and blade fragments recovered centuries later, marking where the attack collapsed. The restoration of 1660 brought victory's cost. King Charles II ordered the imprisonment of Plymouth's parliamentary leaders on Drake's Island, their cells visible from the waterfront they had defended. 5 years later, construction began on the Royal Citadel, a star-shaped fortress whose cannon faced not only seaward but inward toward the town itself, a configuration widely interpreted as warning against future defiance. When the first Royal Navy Dockyard opened at Stoke Damerel on the Tymar's eastern bank in 1690, Plymouth's transformation from merchant port to naval stronghold became permanent, the harbour that had launched the Mayflower now arming the fleet that would patrol 2 hemispheres. The war with France finally persuaded the Crown that Plymouth Sound required permanent infrastructure. In 1690, the first Royal Navy Dockyard opened on the eastern bank of the Tamar, in the parish of Stoke Damerel, and within 3 decades the establishment employed over 300 men cutting timber, forging iron and assembling hulls in covered slips that contemporary observers described as the largest in Western Europe. By 1733, the separate settlement known simply as Dock had grown to 3,000 inhabitants, and the reek of pitch and oakum hung over the shipwright yards each morning, a constant sensory feature recorded throughout the century by naval officers and visiting clerks alike. The Dockyard's vessels carried Britain's ambitions to every ocean. On the 25th of August 1768, Captain James Cook departed Plymouth Sound aboard Endeavour, bound for Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus, and then to search the uncharted latitudes of the southern Pacific for the rumoured continent Terra Australis. Cook returned in 1771 with charts that redrew European knowledge of the world, departed again in 1772 for a second circumnavigation, and left Plymouth for the final time in 1776, a voyage that ended with his death in the Hawaiian Islands 3 years later. The same wharves that fitted Endeavour's stores sent dozens of lesser-known expeditions outward, each departure recorded in dockyard ledgers as timber, cordage and salt provisions, loaded aboard vessels whose return could never be guaranteed. 4 decades after Cook's last departure, another arrival marked the Dockyard's place in the closing act of European war. On the 24th of July 1815, HMS Bellerophon anchored in the Sound carrying Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, until his defeat at Waterloo 6 weeks earlier. For a fortnight, thousands of Plymouth residents rowed out in hired boats to circle the warship, straining to glimpse the prisoner who had commanded armies from Madrid to Moscow. Contemporary accounts describe the summer haze thick with small craft, voices calling across the water, and the strange stillness of the figure who paced the quarterdeck under guard. On the 8th of August, the Admiralty transferred Napoleon to HMS Northumberland for the passage to St. Helena, and the harbour that had launched Cook's search for undiscovered continents now watched the departure of the man whose ambition had convulsed the known world for 2 decades. The new century found Devonport constructing dreadnoughts in slipways that had launched Cook's vessels a century and a half earlier. Between 1914 and 1918, the naval yards extended across 40 acres of reclaimed riverbank, welding armour plate for battle cruisers, whilst Empire troops disembarked at the 3 towns' quays. Plymouth mourned 7,000 dead by the armistice, their names recorded in parish registers from Plympton to Stonehouse. The depression that followed struck hardest along the waterfront, where shipwrights accustomed to wartime wages queued at labour exchanges in districts that had merged into a single county borough in 1914. The spring of 1941 brought warfare of a different order. Between the 20th of March and the 30th of April, the Luftwaffe mounted 7 major raids targeting the Devonport naval installations, but contemporary accounts describe cascades of incendiary bombs falling across the medieval centre and Victorian terraces with equal density. Civil defence records document 1,172 civilian deaths, over 4,000 injuries, and the systematic destruction of 18,000 dwellings, 3,754 razed entirely to their foundations. Archaeological surveys conducted after the war revealed that scarcely a medieval timber survived intact within the old harbour quarter. Survivors reported walking streets they no longer recognised. The Guildhall's roof lay open to the sky. St Andrew's Church stood gutted, its Gothic tracery framing ash and rubble. The Royal Hotel on Royal Parade, where officers had taken lodgings since Trafalgar, existed only as blackened walls. Drake Circus, the broad Victorian junction linking the 3 towns, became a landscape of fractured masonry and twisted girders. Plymouth ranked amongst the most heavily bombed cities in England, its density of destruction comparable only to Coventry and the East End docks. 3 years later, the harbour that had dispatched the Mayflower became a principal embarkation point for Operation Overlord. Throughout May and early June 1944, tens of thousands of American and British troops assembled along the waterfront, boarding landing craft bound for Utah and Omaha Beach. Observers noted the contrast, ruins still uncleared from the blitz-framing columns of soldiers marching towards the Sound. The city that had sent pilgrims to found a new world, now dispatching liberators to reclaim an old one. On Plymouth Hoe, the Naval Memorial records 23,186 names of Royal Navy personnel lost at sea across both world wars, their vessels gone down in waters from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The obelisk faces the harbour mouth, where every departure for 4 centuries had carried consequence beyond return. Sir Patrick Abeer Crombie's Reconstruction Plan, published in April 1944, whilst rubble still choked the streets, called for demolishing what remained of the medieval heart to create wide modernist boulevards radiating from Armada Way. Between 1951 and 1964, over 20,000 new homes rose where narrow lanes had stood for centuries, transforming Plymouth into a grid of prefabricated estates and concrete civic buildings that divided opinion from the day they opened. The 1962 Civic Centre, Grade 2 listed by 2007, exemplifies the uncompromising vision that replaced what the Luftwaffe destroyed. Yet beneath the post-war architecture, the same sound that witnessed Drake's defiance and the Mayflower's departure continues to shape the city's rhythm. Devonport remains the only base in the United Kingdom capable of maintaining nuclear submarines, its docks still active with the fleet that has sailed from these waters for 3 centuries. The ferries departing daily for Roscoff and Santander trace routes, merchants travelled in Plymouth's first trading season. And the university's 18,000 students walk streets rebuilt atop foundations laid when Sutton received its charter. The harbour endures, Atlantic tides still answering to patterns older than any name this city has carried.